To understand why Half-Life Alyx is in VR and why a modded mouse and keyboard version would be missing the point, you should check out the interview they had over on Adam Savage's Tested channel, which was done last December. I'll be summarising the points they talked about in this video. Why choose VR with Half-Life? Their response was inputs. Half-Life has always been about innovation, and a new input method, like VR, is the easiest way of expanding the gameplay and immersive possibilities. VR with a headset, 2 controllers and its 6 degrees of freedom provides far more ways of interacting with stuff than a mouse and keyboard can. It's more natural for humans to use, and from testing they've seen new player behaviours thanks to this new medium. Think of the possibilities. To start developing for VR, Valve used their lab demo to study a lot of different people interacting with VR, many for the first time. Valve soon realised how effortlessly players were doing things that were difficult when using traditional input methods. If you think about how long FPS games have been around, unless you've been following it since the beginning, you won't appreciate how difficult it is for new players to get into it these days and to pick up the knowledge that veteran players take for granted. In 2020, it's extremely difficult to cater for all player abilities at once. But VR allows for exactly that. Anyone can just pick it up and learn within a few minutes, without the complexities and knowledge that conventional gaming requires to achieve the same actions or results. At one point, Valve said that VR with just one button per hand still provides more options than a mouse and keyboard would. This isn't about dumbing it down or about nerfing pro players. It's about providing a new, more intuitive and interactive experience that everybody can benefit from. The game isn't just a new series of corridors for players to rush through, looking for the next enemy to shoot at. If you go into Half-Life Alyx expecting it to be just like other shooter games but better, you'll probably be disappointed. Expect a completely new experience though, and you'll be pleasantly surprised. But VR comes with its own challenges that the industry has been trying to figure out. Number 1, how to transport a player to a place. And number 2, how to engage them to interact with it. So while you may think the big thing about VR is the thing that goes over your head, Valve actually concentrated more on the things which are held in your hands. They wanted VR not just to be a sensory experience, but also an active one, all about the new inputs and activities it enables. This is why you couldn't just play Half-Life Alyx in non-VR mode. An analogy I thought up is that it's like watching a movie on a radio. You might kind of get it, but you wouldn't get what makes it great. You probably walk away thinking, yeah, it's not as good as the other radio things I listen to. This is twice now that I've implied that Half-Life Alyx isn't as good as existing games, but what I really mean is that I don't think it can be compared because its gameplay and mechanics are so completely different, even if at times it can look similar when viewed on a 2D screen. So what are these new possibilities it enables? For a start, it makes people play slower. A room in VR takes more time to pass through than a room in a standard game. I think the Boneworks team discovered this recently. To start with, they didn't put checkpoints in their levels because they assumed players wouldn't take long enough to need them. But I can certainly say that when I first started out in VR, those levels were big challenges to get through, especially in continuous locomotion. When watching people play through early versions of Half-Life Alyx, they noticed a lot of players would spend time looking into corners or at what's inside lockers and so on, and observing them behaving like this influenced how they developed these levels. They started adding more details in corners, and more stuff to find in lockers and cabinets and fridges. With a standard FPS game like Half-Life 2, it was hard to justify the time it took to do this because most players would skip right past them. But in VR, they know that their efforts won't be wasted, because they're confident a significant number of players would do it. It must be rewarding to make levels for VR when you know that players will actually care about what you add to it. And it wasn't just about adding more stuff. Since it would be so heavily scrutinised and so up close to the player, it was important that it looked and behaved how the player would expect these things too. I've already talked about the insane amounts of detail on small props like this teacup here, but at some point you've got to draw the line. You can't simulate reality, and doing so wouldn't necessarily make a better game. As an example of going too far, at one point when making Half-Life 2, they added physics to the player's body, but comically stupid stuff would then happen, like they'd die when they sprinted into a wall. So obviously they removed that because, even though it might have been more realistic, it wasn't how players would want for it to behave. So while Half-Life 2 helped them to strike the balance in standard 2D games, they've had to strike a balance that works in VR for Half-Life Alyx. And they went about this by iterating countless times, by getting feedback from players, and then by iterating some more. In other words, expect interactivity, but expect there to be a limit. They say that you can never get it to work 100% of the time for all players. They simply aim to get the physics and stuff to work as long as the player isn't trying to break it. but if they push it too hard, then it probably will still break. Which is great news for speedrunners, who I hope to see abusing Half-Life Alyx's levels very soon. And the same compromises apply to your hands, which they put a lot of time into getting right. If you're worried about floating hands being distracting, they reassure you that you only notice it's weird when watching gameplay footage. When you're actually playing, it soon makes sense and you stop noticing it. When it came to developing them, early on they decided that the hands needed to be solid, because people expect that much from them at least. They want to be able to move things around when they push them, for instance. Which is simple enough, but for game developers, so hard. They next ensured the interactions your hands had with the world made sense. While only the hands are visible, the arms which connect you to them are modelled for detective purposes. This is to prevent stupid stuff from happening, like accidentally trapping one of your hands on the wrong side of a door you just entered. Stuff like that. How about the way the player moves through the level? Again, it's worth stressing that teleporting isn't the only way you can move. There will also be smooth movement. But they spoke about teleporting in this interview and covered some quite interesting things about it. Much like your floating hands, although teleporting looks silly in gameplay videos, when you're using it in-game, you quickly forget you're doing it. They also wanted to hide the playable space from the player. If you try the Steam VR previews, it makes it obvious where you can and can't travel to. But this has been hidden more for Half-Life Alyx, for immersive reasons. But it does cause problems when you're trying to explore a room with 80 objects in. They quickly learned that straight-up teleporting wasn't actually an option. It still has to simulate your travel between the two locations. The game needs to know how you went from point A to point B, because sometimes it would involve climbing or crawling underneath something. They said that subtle visual and audio cues helped the player to understand how they had reached their destination, or to make it obvious why they were unable to make it to their destination. So really, even the teleport style of movement is more like traversal, because treating it as this will help to stop players from making impossible movements. If you teleport past a corridor with enemies in, they'll still know that you ran across their vision. If you teleport past a barnacle's tentacle, it will still get you, and so on. I still don't know how they're going to stop players from teleporting through the level too quickly, but I guess something's in place to stop this. So while teleporting might sound like cheating, in a lot of ways it sounds like smooth locomotion would be easier because you have more control over how you choose to go from point A to point B. Valve worried that teleporting was going to be an inferior movement style, but the more they worked on it, the happier they were. It's safe to say that teleporting is one of this game's most controversial features. So it will be interesting to look back at this to see how players responded to it, and how many actually chose to use it as their preferred navigation style. And the last thing they covered were the gravity gloves. A lot of the limitations of playing the game in VR in a confined space are solved with these things, because it means you can easily pick things up even when they're beyond the playable space, and it means you don't have to crouch down so much. Valve said it was hard to decide on how these objects should fly towards you, which way around they should face, how much control you have over that with your own hand movements, and how the player should catch these things as they're flying towards them. But the hardest thing about the gravity gloves was figuring out how to activate them. Remember, you can already pick stuff up normally in the game. They started by having a different button for the gravity glove option, but players would use it far less and would often pause for a moment before figuring out how to use it. So they got rid of the button completely and made it more closely mimic how you pick stuff up close by, but far away instead. This made it a lot more intuitive, and players started using this feature a lot more. You can see how the object you're trying to pick up is highlighted in some of the gameplay footage we've seen so far. You may think that, since Valve developed the Valve Index headset and Knuckles controllers, that they designed the game to work best with them. But I think the goal of Half-Life Alyx isn't just to sell copies and headsets, but to show the world what a VR game has the potential to be. They ensured this game worked with as many different controller types as possible. The goal with this game was to offer complex gameplay actions with the same ease and natural interaction for different setups. So rather than to develop the game with a particular controller type in mind, they developed interaction systems which would work well across all controller types, and then polished it for each one to remove friction. This all turned out better than expected, and they kept adding to it as players wanted more. So, in conclusion, VR offers new gameplay possibilities that benefit everybody. You could replicate a lot of this with a keyboard and mouse, but it would not be as intuitive. As in, rather than being simple and fun, it would be fiddly and annoying. Gaming with 6 degrees of freedom is a promising medium because it multiplies what gaming can be in terms of interactivity. It lights up more of a player's brain by providing higher input and output levels. Valve worried it would lose its appeal after a while, but they saw no player fatigue. Even in early stages, when there were no tooltips or ammo counters, people just seemed to figure it out naturally from pulling and grabbing at things. It seems like the VR system they've developed is very natural for humans, and not just for combat, but for exploration and puzzles too. This all bodes well for VR, and might mean that you come back to Half-Life Alyx for a second playthrough, and then some. Valve was asked what they saw their role in VR as being. Should they be sharing what they've learned about VR with other developers to help further the medium? Valve said that it was more about enabling others to build on the foundations of what Half-Life Alyx has laid. The game itself contains a lot of the stuff that Valve has learned about building a working VR game, and they hope it will help others, and maybe the players as well, to understand the potential of this new medium. I know that a lot of people are holding off VR until there are more proper games available for it. They're not willing to try it just for a single game, even if it is the best game ever. And there are other people who are waiting for the technology to mature before they buy a headset. A no-compromise wireless VR kit would be the next logical step. While those things will hopefully come with time, I believe that Valve is using Half-Life Alyx as a catalyst to motivate game developers to begin considering VR experiences, and to get players seriously considering VR gaming as a possibility. Their interview was filmed in December. At this point, they were no longer adding brand new features or environments to the game. They were instead focusing on bug fixing, and adding as many accessibility options to cater for as many players as possible. They were working on making the game playable with just one hand, for all those one-handed players out there, which I guess has helped by making all the guns single-handed. In just over 2 weeks, we'll know for sure if all this has paid off. This video has been a summary of the interview, with my own thoughts thrown in. I still recommend you check out the original interview, as it's jolly good fun to watch.